This podcast is a joint effort of the Jewish People Policy Institute and the Jewish Journal.
I am very proud to be Jewish.
Yes, I know. I have an accent.
Those days are over.
על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל.
הבה נגיד לו, if you will it, it is no dream.
Hello and welcome to Rosner's Domain, and thank you for listening. My name is Shmuel Rosner. A few weeks ago, under the headline, "Is Annexation Good? Ask the Settlers," I wrote the following article, and you can read it on the Jewish Journal website under Rosner's Domain, but let me read you a paragraph or two. So here we go. The most interesting debate concerning annexation isn't the one between Israelis and Palestinians, left and right-wingers, Jewish Israelis and Jewish Americans, or President Donald Trump and presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden. It's the one between settlers who support or oppose annexation. Yes, many settlers oppose annexation, or to be accurate, they oppose the proposed annexation based on the Trump peace plan. Their opposition is based on a strong ideological argument. It's based on the view that by annexing part of the territory, Israel is both receiving and giving up land. It would get about 1/3 of the West Bank, but if one day the Palestinians come to terms with the compromises they must accept if they wish to end the conflict, they would have a state in the other parts of Judea and Samaria. So, with that, my guest today is Oded Revivi. Hello, Oded.
Hello.
Revivi is the mayor of the city Efrat and has served as the chief foreign envoy for the Israeli mayors of Judea and Samaria. So, he is a settler. Oded, do you support or oppose the annexation plan?
So you basically referred your listeners to one article that you wrote. I think I can refer them to many articles and news outlets which clearly state that I'm a supporter of the peace plan, the peace vision, the Trump deal. I've been following it very carefully. I would say even before it actually came into realization, when Jason Greenblatt came to Israel as the envoy of the president 3.5 years ago. I was in DC when the president announced it last January, and I'm definitely one of those who support the initiative.
So let me read you another paragraph from another article. This one is by Robert Satloff, the executive director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And Satloff, at the outset of his article, he says that he is a Zionist, but then he continues to say that annexation defies all logic. And I'll read you his argument. For Washington, it kills whatever slim chance remains for President Trump's peace plan. For Palestinians, it validates the claim that Israel just wants territorial expansion. For Jerusalem, it abandons a relatively secure and surprisingly durable status quo for no real reason. If the US and Israeli government can't convince even me of the logic here, there is no hope they will convince others that annexation is anything but a domestic political maneuver fueled by the growing electoral power of Israel's ideologically motivated settlement movement, devoid of strategic rationale. So now I'll give you time, and maybe you can help me explain the strategic rationale behind annexation.
So first of all, I think it is extremely important to be accurate in the terminology. What is suggested by the Trump deal is applying Israeli law. Issues and phrases and terminology of annexation and sovereignty are not mentioned. They haven't come into creation yet, and they will only come into creation further down the road if we ever go on it. The idea of the Trump deal and the reason that I'm a supporter of it, is because institutions like the Washington Institute, basically, I would even say since 1968, since the Roger Initiative, have always tried to ignore the reality and try go back to historical lines without even checking what they are. Therefore, what's their significance and if they're still relevant. The request from the State of Israel was always to withdraw back to the 1967 line. The 1967 line, the green line, is not an official border. It's basically the line of the ceasefire of the War of Independence way back in 1948, but it came about as being the holy line that everybody respects. All the initiatives since 1968 up until when President Trump was elected were led by different leaders, different countries, at different timing. The result was always the same. The result always came back to a deadlock. And it didn't matter if Israel was the one who initiated a building freeze, releasing terrorists, offering between 92 to 96% of the land. It didn't make any difference. The dead end always came sooner or later. The reason I'm a supporter of the Trump deal is because it came and looked at the reality and said, we want to try and learn from the mistakes that were done in the past. We want to come with a vision for peace, which will look at the reality on the ground, and from there try to create a better reality and a better peaceful resolution. When they came to the ground, they actually mapped where do the Jews live and where do the Arabs live. And the conceptual map that they came about with basically draws where the majority of the Jewish people who live in Judea and Samaria actually live. The understanding that nobody will need to give up his house, no house will be demolished, is a starting point for both Jews and Arabs, and is supposed to build the confidence of the individuals in actually engaging in it, not worrying that if they engage, they will find themselves deployed from their own homes. Regarding the future, in the past, Israel always was the one who made the concessions at first. As I said, building freeze or even releasing terrorists who murdered innocent people. This time, the perspective is different. If the Palestinians really want to engage in peace negotiations, then they have to take upon themselves 10 preliminary conditions, which, to be honest with you, I think that probably the majority of the listeners at the moment will agree on. That families of terrorists will stop getting funding from the Palestinian Authority. That the Palestinian Authority will dematerialize Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip. That the Palestinian Authority will realize the right of the Jewish people to have a Jewish state. These things were demands which were put in the past, but never came into any operation. Now, in order to start a peace negotiation, these preliminary conditions not only need to be accepted, but actually have to be proven that they have actually taken place. And then, if they do, we start peace negotiations, which, as you mentioned, and part of the criticism coming from the right, can actually lead to a potential Palestinian state. So Prime Minister Netanyahu says, well, Prime Minister, a Palestinian state, according to President Trump's definition, the American ambassador to Israel calls it, if the Palestinians will turn into Canadians. I say to my peers, we have today a Palestinian Authority. It doesn't really matter if we're going to call it a Palestinian Authority or a Palestinian state. If it means that we will be able to have peaceful relationship with our neighbors, it's something that we need to give a chance to.
Well,
Now,
but let me ask you this before you continue. You keep talking about your support for the Trump peace plan, but you somehow ignore the fact that we are now at a situation in which Israel intends to implement Israeli law during the month of July or maybe later this summer. So do we have to time the actual implementation of Israeli law for this time? Why not wait for these wonderful negotiations that you talk about?
So this is exactly the point that I wanted to get to beforehand. In the past, timelines were declared. Nothing happened during those timelines. When the timeline ended, then everybody said, oh, we need more time. There was a declaration of 10 months of a building freeze in order to create a peaceful atmosphere, to build a trust, and to start negotiations. What happened during those 10 months? There was complete building freeze. Did any meetings actually take place? None. So this plan comes in a different perspective. What does it say to the Palestinians? You have lost one major thing. You have lost the ability to veto what is on the table. You have lost the ability to veto the engagement in peace negotiations. It's an indication to the pragmatic people. This offer is less of an offer than what was offered in the past. It's also come after a very long period of time that there were no offers on the table. If you carry on not missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity, who knows when will be the next offer and how much smaller will it be? And therefore, even just by that, creating a change in the course of action of what happens first and what happens then, there is an indication to the Palestinians that you're better off actually engaging and coming to the table because the offers are growing smaller and are coming in a less frequent appearance. And that's why it has to start. It's a process that has been building up with this administration for the last 3.5 years. It's not that they woke up today and they said, now we want to do it. And yes, there are things which don't need a lot of preparation. Applying Israeli law in Judea and Samaria is relatively a simple declaration that needs to be made, because some of the listeners might not be aware, but the law that applies today in Judea and Samaria, in the best case scenario, it's a military order where they take a legislation which was made by the Israeli parliament, by the Knesset, and applied to Judea and Samaria. In less good cases, it's Jordanian law which still applies up until today. And in even worse situations, it's the Ottoman law which has been legislated 150 to 500 years ago, which applies to up until today. Even though the market has changed, reality has changed, transactions have changed, but no legal adjustments have been made. So just by declaring that the law will apply, you're creating more certainty and you're putting pressure over the Palestinians to finally really engage in peace negotiations to create something which will be more sustainable than what has been up until today.
So let me ask you about this window of opportunity that many of the supporters of annexation or implementation of Israeli law talk about. This window of opportunity is really very small because President Trump is now in power, but we know that coming November he will have to get re-elected, or else an opponent, Senator Joe Biden, might be elected president. And we know that other than President Trump, there are no international supporters for his plan. Senator Biden opposes all moves of annexation. The international community, the UN, the European Union, almost all countries oppose this move. So should we rely on the remaining 4 months of President Trump in power to make such significant move when we know that everyone else opposes it?
First of all, I think that not everybody else opposes it. I think there hasn't been enough preparation time, and you see that both the Israelis and the Americans are now catching up, and you see that the head of Mossad is going through different Arab countries, explaining the vision and explaining what's behind it and explaining the logic to it. Second of all, sometimes things only after they happen, people start realizing the benefits in it and join in. And third of all, I have received quite a few concerns, mainly from Democrats, saying, how can you do such a move only 4 months before the election? However, and especially those, they seem to forget that President Obama, in less than 4 months before elections, did two drastic decisions which have influence over Israel up until today, even though at one stage he didn't know who was going to be the next president, and the second one he actually knew who was the next president. When he signed with Netanyahu the agreement on foreign aid, basically forcing Netanyahu to accept a deal which will be in place for 10 years, not allowing him to change it with any administration that will come in afterwards, he declared policy for the next 10 years, even though he wasn't going to be president or his party was going to be president. After the election, when it was obvious that President Trump had won, but he wasn't sworn in yet, Obama's administration decided not to veto a decision in the Security Council, which the implications Israel is suffering up until today. So the American ambassador is still in office. He has prepared this policy for the last 3.5 years. The window of opportunity is not just with him sitting in the White House, but also what is happening globally. And what is happening globally, we see for the first time in history where we have Arab countries that in the past had a dilemma to show their alliance to the United States or to the former Soviet Union. Now their decision needs to be made between the United States and Iran. The majority of them want to join forces with the United States. And that is an opportunity regarding Israel and regarding the United States that we didn't have in the past. The same is true for the Palestinian Authority and Jordan. They're both heavily reliant on Israel and the United States, and that is again an opportunity that we didn't have in the past. Now, those who oppose, traditionally, they came from the two-state school. They were those who supported the two-state school. And in the right, those who oppose the plan, they see the potential of creating here a two-state solution, and that's why they oppose it. So when you have those who actually are supporters of a two-state solution saying, no, we're going to oppose it, it really raises an eyebrow. What are you really arguing for? Because if you oppose this plan, and we know that plans which were on the table haven't succeeded, so what is going to be John Biden's policy if he does get elected to become president? John Kerry was there with a very specific policy, and it didn't succeed. That's why this current administration came with a change of approach under the belief that if we try and do things differently, we might get a different result.
Right. So let me ask you about your friends within Israel's right wing, within the settlement movement. And again, I'm going to use a quote, this time from former Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who already announced that he opposes the moves planned by Israel this summer. And here's what he said. I don't want shortcuts that harm my ability to put facts on the ground and that weaken the settlements. I prefer to go without it. I will persevere, work hard, set up settlements and fight with the Palestinians for another 20 years. And in 20 years, the American government will give me sovereignty over all of the territory because there will be settlements on all of the territory. So please explain, where do you see his logic as faulty?
I'll tell you what my major problem with people like Bezalel Smotrich. They come with a perspective which Israel can do whatever they want, whenever they want, and however we want. They believe that Israel doesn't need any recognition or any support from the international community. They fail to understand the threats that Israel is facing in international different bodies like the European Court of Justice, the Human Rights Court of Justice, like the United Nations. Now, I'm not saying that we have to take into account every single time threats that we receive from the international community. But we do know that one of the major concerns of the international community is enabling private individuals to have equal rights. The issue of equal rights is extremely complex when we discuss the issue of Israel, because as far as I see it, the idea behind the Oslo Accord was that the Palestinians will actually have voting rights, but instead of having voting rights for the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, they were able to vote for the Palestinian Authority. It is true that for the last 14 years, the Palestinian Authority hasn't had elections. But when I get accusations of not offering the Arabs voting rights, I say, you got the picture wrong, because they actually can vote for the Palestinian Authority. You shouldn't come with us with the criticism. You should ask the Palestinian Authority why they haven't voted for their elected institution. President Trump's vision sees the danger of not allowing those Arabs to have voting rights, and that's why there is an option of creating a Palestinian state according to the declaration of President Trump, or less of a state according to Prime Minister Netanyahu, but it's in order to secure the democratic elements of Israel. Now, we've been here 53 years. Reality has been created on the ground. Some of the areas are way more populated. Some of them are extremely isolated. Now, the conceptual map tries to look at reality as it is today, tries and indicate to the international community, we're willing to compromise. We're willing to go forward, even down roads which we are concerned about, because when we withdraw from Gaza, we know that what has become of Gaza is way more dangerous than what was in Gaza whilst we were there. But in order to satisfy requests from the international community, in order to secure the Jewish majority of the state of Israel, the plan provides answers for both those issues. If you want to ignore both those issues, and you think that in 20 years you'll manage to create here a different reality, go ahead, good luck. But let's not forget that when Obama was in the White House, for 8 years, there were building restrictions in Judea and Samaria, as Prime Minister Netanyahu used to quote him, not one more brick. If you are right, and Biden gets elected to become president, who can guarantee us that we won't be another 8 years in full building freeze, and Bezalel Smotrich's dream of creating here a completely changing demographic situation won't come into reality. So you can carry on being sitting on the fence or a backseat driver and hoping that the future will be better, or you can take the lead and say, I'm willing to take something which is not complete, which is not full, which has downsides to it, but it's actually indicating again, I'm willing to do a compromise in order to satisfy two of my concerns, one, the international community, and one, protecting the Jewish majority.
And if it was up to you to implement this plan, and I know it's not, would you do it all at once? Would you implement Israeli law to all settlements at once, or do you think it's preferable for Israel to go in stages, to begin with something smaller, maybe the area in which you live, of the Gush Etzion block, or maybe another block, and only later move to other parts of the area?
Generally speaking, I don't like the attitude of a salami, that you cut each slice at one time. Even though it might be easier to swallow, sometimes it raises more difficulties and you spend more time in actually chewing instead of actually taking the whole big bite. If we do it in stages, every single stage will raise the same level of criticism and discussion. If we put it as a whole on the table and we say this is the offer, then you know exactly what's the give and take. If we start, and we can just take the example of building permits in Judea and Samaria, it is no secret that when the government decided to build 100 units, the level of criticism was just as high when they decided to build 1,000 units. So the plan actually has logic behind it. It actually has a concept behind it, and that's why I wouldn't break it into stages, even though I do understand that maybe because of political reasons, it will have to be broken into stages. I'm not sure it will turn it into being more successful.
Would you say that doing it on stages is worth it if one wants to get the blue and white party on board to have a more consensual move rather than do something that only half of the population or even less support?
I think the American administration's demand, whether it was made publicly or secretly, that they want both Netanyahu and blue and white to agree on the move, is definitely an indication that they would like to see a wide consensus within Israel moving this forward. Blue and white are in somewhat a link catch that it is hard to predict how they will act, because it is quite obvious that large percentage of the people who actually voted for blue and white are not in support of this plan, whether good or bad, whether right or wrong, but that's where they stand politically. Blue and white, Benny Gantz, hoping to become the next prime minister within less than a year and a half. If President Trump gets reelected, he doesn't want to be the one who got President Trump upset and not promoting his own deal. And the third problem that Benny Gantz has is that if he gets Netanyahu upset and doesn't move forward with him, Netanyahu can go to another round of elections where the polls at the moment predict that blue and white is going to come back to the parliament with only 10 members of Knesset and Likud party is going to become stronger. I don't think that that is going to make him closer to the chair of the prime minister. So how he will react, it's a bit difficult to know. Whether his decision actually will project a wider consensus or not, I think not, because we know that the Israeli public is split. But here I think is another very surprising figure. About 10 days ago, one of the TV channels in Israel did a survey as to how many Israelis actually show interest in this issue. And surprisingly enough, or maybe not surprising at all, but the first two items were health issues and financial issues. And in the third place, with only 4% of Israelis actually showed any interest or concern about the Trump deal. So we have a situation where there are way more important things for the Israeli public attention at the moment. However, sometimes opportunities, sometimes timelines, sometimes historical events don't occur when we invite them. And I think this is the confusion that we have with this specific issue at this specific time.
Let me dedicate my last question to many of our listeners. We conduct this conversation in English, and it's posted on the Jewish Journal website in Los Angeles. So many of our listeners are Jewish Americans, and it's not a secret that most Jewish Americans would probably oppose the plan and raise many moral issues related to this plan of what they will surely call annexation. So what is the message you think Israel should send when it communicates with this important group of Jewish Americans, and how should it convey the importance of this move for Israel's future?
So I wrote an op-ed in Haaretz, I think about a week ago, in Hebrew. And it was actually an op-ed which was referred to Benny Gantz. And it gave quotes both of Benny Gantz and Amos Yadlin from the INSS, saying that I'm surprised that they're not supporting this plan, because this plan is actually one that the left, the Israeli left, the Democrats, this is the plan that they always promoted. So you can say that the dimensions might be different, but the concept, the idea, is definitely one of those that the left has always promoted. It's obvious to me and it's obvious to my peers on the right wing, and that's why some of them oppose it, because they see the footprints of the left in this plan. A few days later, Amos Yadlin actually published an op-ed in response to my op-ed. He did not deny that he actually sent a proposal to President Trump of a peace vision, and that he can see his fingerprint on the Trump deal. However, his only concern with the Trump deal is that only stage 1 will take place, and we won't get to stage 2 and stage 3. So my suggestion, my request, my hope to the listeners as you've described them, and I hope that they are a wider group than what you've described, but this deal, even though it's coming from a completely unpredictable president, in a way is a piece of art, because it really tried to balance between plans that were in the past which were promoted by the left, dreams of people on the right. You see the opposition both on the left and on the right, and as a lawyer, the judge always used to tell me, if the compromise is difficult for both parties, it means that it's a good compromise. We're talking about a compromise. It's painful to both sides, and that's why it is a good compromise. So let's ignore for a minute who is behind it. Let's ignore for a minute what time framework we are before election. Let's look honestly in what each party was praying for, hoping, trying to promote in the past, and see if you have enough resemblance here in what you were hoping, and maybe this plan is not as bad as you think it is.
Last question, is it happening?
You know better than I do that since the destruction of the Second Temple, a prophecy has been given to 3 types of people that I don't want to be included in any one of those. I don't know. Things are changing by the day. I think we can see that the American administration hasn't lost interest. The fact that meetings were taking place last week in DC, the fact that the team has come back to Israel with more homework, we see that it is still in the pipeline. We see that it's still in the discussion room. There are a lot of ifs, what needs to happen in order for it to actually take place. I think we'll have to wait patiently and see what happens during this week. And maybe I'll go on air with you again, and then we'll see what happened and what should have happened.
Oded Revivi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
To be Jewish,
Yes, I know. I have an accent.
those days are over.
על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל.
Havana Gilo, if you will it, it is no dream.
אורי